Last night's episode of Jimmy Kimmel Live took a shocking turn when legendary actor Harrison Ford walked off set following an explosive confrontation with host Jimmy Kimmel over Hollywood politics and cancel culture. The atmosphere in the studio felt different from the moment Harrison Ford walked onto the Jimmy Kimmel Live set. The 81-year-old Hollywood legend, known for his no-nonsense attitude and legendary roles as Han Solo and Indiana Jones, carried himself with his usual stoic demeanor. But there was something in his eyes that suggested this wouldn't be just another promotional appearance. Jimmy Kimmel, flashing his trademark grin, welcomed Ford to thunderous applause from the studio audience. "Harrison Ford, everybody. The man, the myth, the legend," Kimmel announced, his voice carrying that familiar late-night host enthusiasm that had made him a household name. Ford settled into the guest chair with his characteristic understated presence, offering a polite nod to the audience before turning his attention to Kimmel. The initial pleasantries went smoothly enough. Discussion about Ford's latest project, a few lighthearted anecdotes about working with various directors, and the obligatory stories about his famous on-set injuries that had become part of his public persona. But as the interview progressed, Kimmel began steering the conversation toward territory that would prove to be a minefield. "You know, Harrison, you've been in this business for over 5 decades. You've seen Hollywood change dramatically. What do you think about how the industry handles controversial figures these days?" Ford's expression shifted almost imperceptibly, his jaw tightening slightly. "What do you mean by that, Jimmy?" Kimmel leaned back in his chair, his smile taking on a more calculated edge. "Well, we've seen a lot of actors face consequences for things they've said or done. Some people call it accountability, others call it cancel culture. You've always been pretty outspoken about your political views. Do you ever worry about saying the wrong thing?" The question hung in the air for a moment too long. Ford's hands, resting on the arms of his chair, seemed to grip slightly tighter. "I think people should be able to express their opinions without fear of having their careers destroyed by a mob mentality," he replied carefully. Kimmel's eyebrows rose slightly, sensing an opportunity. "That's interesting. So you think some of the people who faced consequences maybe didn't deserve it? I mean, we're talking about some pretty serious allegations in some cases." "I'm talking about the principle of the thing," Ford said, his voice maintaining its characteristic gravelly tone but with an underlying tension. "There's a difference between holding people accountable for genuine wrongdoing and destroying someone's livelihood because they expressed an unpopular opinion or made a mistake years ago." The studio audience, which had been periodically chuckling at Kimmel's jokes throughout the evening, grew noticeably quieter. Some shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the conversation was taking an unexpected turn. Kimmel pressed further, his journalist instincts seemingly overriding his role as entertainer. "But Harrison, don't you think that people in positions of influence, like actors and celebrities, have a responsibility to be careful about what they say, especially when it comes to sensitive topics?" Ford's eyes narrowed slightly. "Careful according to whom? You? The Twitter mob? Some corporate boardroom?" His voice remained controlled, but there was steel beneath it now. "I've been in this business since before you were born, Jimmy. I've seen trends come and go, and I've seen good people destroyed by hysteria. I wouldn't call holding people accountable for hate speech hysteria." Kimmel shot back, his own tone becoming more pointed. "When someone uses their platform to spread harmful ideologies or make discriminatory comments, shouldn't there be consequences?" The tension in the studio was palpable now. Camera operators continued filming, but several crew members exchanged glances. In the control room, producers were likely debating whether to cut to commercial. Ford leaned forward slightly, his legendary intensity now fully focused on his host. "And who decides what constitutes hate speech, Jimmy? You? The network executives? Some algorithm designed by 20-something programmers in Silicon Valley?" He paused, letting the question hang. "Or maybe it's decided by talk show hosts who think they're arbiters of moral authority." The comment hit like a physical blow. Kimmel's practiced smile faltered for just a moment, replaced by something harder. "I think most reasonable people can recognize hate speech when they see it, Harrison. We're not talking about complex philosophical debates here. We're talking about basic human decency." "Basic human decency," Ford repeated, his voice carrying a tone that suggested he found the phrase inadequate. That's a convenient phrase, isn't it? Broad enough to mean whatever you want it to mean. The audience was now completely silent, sensing they were witnessing something unprecedented. This wasn't the usual playful back and forth between host and guest. This was something raw and real, and it was happening live on national television. Kimmel, perhaps realizing he was losing control of the interview, attempted to regain his footing. Look, I think we can all agree that racism, sexism, and bigotry are wrong. When public figures promote those things, they should face consequences. That's not controversial. That's just, there you go again, Ford interrupted, his voice cutting through Kimmel's words like a blade, defining the terms of the debate to suit your narrative. Kimmel's face flushed slightly, his professional composure beginning to crack. I'm not defining anything, Harrison. I'm just pointing out that there are consequences for harmful behavior. That's how society works. Society? Ford's laugh was dry and humorless. Or is it how your particular corner of Hollywood works? Because last I checked, society includes people who don't live in Malibu mansions and don't get their worldview from entertainment industry groupthink. The comment struck a nerve. Kimmel's smile disappeared entirely, replaced by barely contained irritation. That's rich coming from someone who's made millions playing characters that gun down bad guys without consequence. Maybe you're just upset because the real world has more nuance than your movies. Ford's eyes flashed dangerously. Don't lecture me about nuance, Jimmy. And don't pretend that what you do here is anything more than performance art designed to make your audience feel superior to people they've never met. Performance art? Kimmel's voice rose slightly, his careful host persona slipping further. I'm trying to have honest conversations about real issues. Maybe that makes you uncomfortable because you've spent so long hiding behind fictional characters. The studio felt electric now, charged with a tension that had everyone on edge. Camera operators zoomed in, instinctively, sensing they were capturing something historic. In the audience, people were pulling out phones, though security would later confiscate the footage. Ford stood up slowly, his 6-foot frame casting a shadow across Kimmel's desk. Hiding guiding characters? That's what you think I do. His voice carried decades of gravitas, the same intensity that had made him one of cinema's most compelling leading men. Let me tell you something about hiding, Jimmy. At least when I play a character, I'm honest about it. I don't pretend to be something I'm not. Kimmel remained seated but leaned forward aggressively. What's that supposed to mean? It means you sit behind that desk every night pretending to be some kind of moral authority, when really you're just another entertainer desperate for applause, Ford replied, his words cutting through the studio silence like glass. You take complex issues and reduce them to punchlines and applause breaks. You create divisions where there could be understanding. I create divisions? Kimmel's voice cracked slightly, his composure finally breaking. I'm not the one defending people who spread hate and discrimination. I'm not the one making excuses for bigotry. Ford's hands clenched at his sides. There you go again. Anyone who disagrees with your worldview is automatically a bigot. Anyone who questions your methods is defending hate. It's a neat little trick, isn't it? Shut down debate by painting your opponents as monsters. The audience was frozen, caught between fascination and discomfort. This wasn't entertainment anymore. It was a raw confrontation between two men representing different philosophies about art, society, and responsibility. Kimmel stood up now, matching Ford's height as best he could. Maybe some opponents deserve to be painted as monsters. Harrison. Maybe when someone promotes ideas that hurt people, that dehumanize entire groups, they forfeit the right to polite disagreement. And who made you judge and jury? Ford shot back, stepping closer to the desk. When did talk show hosts become the arbiters of acceptable thought? When did comedians start deciding who gets to work and who gets blacklisted? We're not blacklisting anyone, Kimmel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. We're just choosing not to platform hate. Ford's laugh was sharp and bitter. Not platforming hate, that's what you call it. But what you really mean is not platforming anyone who doesn't agree with your political orthodoxy. Anyone who questions the narrative. Anyone who thinks for themselves. The confrontation had reached a fever pitch. Both men were now standing, facing each other across the desk like adversaries in an old Western showdown. The studio lights seemed harsher somehow, casting deep shadows that made the scene look almost cinematic. Kimmel's face was red now, his careful media training abandoned. You know what, Harrison? Maybe the problem isn't cancel culture. Maybe the problem is that people like you can't handle living in a world where your words have consequences, where you can't just say whatever you want without pushback. Ford's eyes narrowed to slits. Consequences. There's that word again. Funny how consequences only seem to flow in one direction, isn't it? Funny how they only apply to people who step out of line from your approved thinking. My approved thinking? Kimmel's voice was almost shrill now. I'm talking about basic human rights, basic decency. If you can't understand that, don't you dare lecture me about human rights, Ford interrupted, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. I've lived through more history than you've read about in your Twitter feed. I've seen real oppression, real injustice, and real consequences for speaking truth to power. What you're doing isn't fighting for human rights. It's performative activism designed to make you feel important. The words hit Kimmel like a physical slap. His face went from red to almost purple, veins visible at his temples. Performative activism? I use my platform to call out hatred and discrimination. I give voice to the voiceless. That's more than hiding behind movie roles and staying silent when it matters. Ford's composure finally cracked completely. Staying silent? Staying silent? His voice boomed across the studio, causing several audience members to flinch. I've been fighting battles before you even knew what a television camera was, but I fought them in the real world, not in some sanitized studio for applause. The studio was dead silent, except for the hum of equipment and the barely audible whispers of panicked producers in the control booth. Security personnel had moved closer, unsure whether they were witnessing an interview gone wrong or something more serious. Kimmel, perhaps sensing he was losing the narrative battle, played his trump card. Oh, please, spare me the war stories, Harrison. You think because you flew planes and did your own stunts, that makes you some kind of authority on moral courage. You're just another privileged Hollywood elite who's upset that the world doesn't bow down to you anymore. The accusation hung in the air like poison. Ford went completely still, his legendary intensity now focused like a laser flame on his host. When he spoke, his voice was quiet but carried the weight of barely contained fury. Privileged Hollywood elite, he repeated slowly, as if tasting each word. That's what you think I am. That's how you dismiss anyone who challenges your worldview. Just label them privileged and elite, and suddenly their opinions don't matter. Kimmel sensed weakness and pressed his advantage. If the shoe fits, Harrison, you've made hundreds of millions of dollars pretending to be heroes, while real heroes deal with the consequences of hate speech and discrimination. Maybe it's time you acknowledged your privilege instead of defending the people who spread it. Ford's hands were trembling now, not with fear but with rage. You want to talk about privilege? Let's talk about the privilege of sitting behind that desk every night, passing judgment on people you've never met, destroying careers with snarky comments and carefully edited segments. Let's talk about the privilege of never having to face real consequences for your actions, because you're on the right side of every issue. I face consequences every day, Kimmel shot back, his voice cracking. I get death threats from your people. I get boycotts and harassment campaigns. Don't pretend like speaking out against hate doesn't come with a price. My people? Ford's voice was incredulous. There it is. There's the real Jimmy Kimmel. Everyone who disagrees with you is part of some monolithic group, some enemy force that you're bravely fighting against. You can't conceive of the possibility that decent people might have different perspectives than you. The confrontation had transcended television now. This was primal, two alpha personalities locked in intellectual combat, with decades of frustration and resentment fueling the fire. Neither man was backing down, and the studio felt like a powder keg ready to explode. Kimmel's voice became shrill and desperate. Different perspectives? Is that what we're calling racism now? Different perspectives? Is that what we're calling sexism and homophobia? Just different ways of looking at the world? Ford stepped around the desk now, closing the distance between them. You keep using those words like talismans, like magic spells, that automatically win arguments. But you know what? I'm not afraid of your labels anymore. I'm not afraid of your Twitter mob, or your cancel campaigns. Maybe you should be, Kimmel replied, his voice dropping to match Ford's intensity. Maybe people who defend hate should face consequences. Maybe the days of hiding behind fame and fortune are over. The threat was unmistakable. Ford's eyes blazed with an intensity that had once made him one of Hollywood's most commanding screen presences. Is that a threat, Jimmy? Are you threatening me on national television? Kimmel realized he'd gone too far, but couldn't back down now. I'm just saying that actions have consequences. Words have consequences. Maybe it's time you learned that. Ford laughed, but there was no humor in it whatsoever. Consequences? From you. A man who's never done anything more dangerous than tell jokes to a studio audience. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. You have no idea what real consequences look like. The studio was holding its collective breath. Cameras continued rolling, but everyone knew they were witnessing something that would either be buried forever or become one of the most infamous moments in television history. Kimmel, perhaps sensing he was completely out of his depth, made one final desperate play. You know what, Harrison? I think our audience deserves to know what kind of person you really are. What kind of values you actually represent. Ford's smile was cold and predatory. By all means, Jimmy. Tell them what kind of person I am. Kimmel's confidence wavered for a moment as he stared into Ford's steely gaze, but his ego wouldn't let him retreat. Fine. I think you're someone who's so insulated by wealth and fame that you've lost touch with reality. I think you're someone who defends bigotry because it doesn't affect you personally. I think you represent everything that's wrong with old Hollywood. The words echoed through the studio like gunshots. Ford stood motionless for several seconds, processing the attack. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet authority of a man who had commanded respect for 5 decades. Old Hollywood, he repeated slowly. You mean the Hollywood that created art instead of propaganda? The Hollywood that told stories instead of delivering sermons? The Hollywood that respected its audience instead of lecturing them? Kimmel's mouth opened to respond, but Ford wasn't finished. Let me tell you about old Hollywood, Jimmy. Old Hollywood gave people like you the platform you're now using to destroy it. Old Hollywood created the industry that made you rich and famous, and old Hollywood understood something that you've forgotten. That entertaining people is a privilege, not a right to indoctrinate them. The studio audience was transfixed, watching a masterclass in controlled fury. Ford's voice never rose above conversational level, but every word carried the weight of absolute conviction. You want to know what kind of person I am? Ford continued, stepping closer until he was directly in front of Kimmel's desk. I'm someone who spent his entire career trying to be worthy of the audience's trust. I'm someone who's risked his life dozens of times to give people authentic entertainment. I'm someone who believes in treating people with dignity even when they disagree with me. Kimmel tried to interrupt. Harrison, I'm not finished. Ford cut him off with surgical precision. You asked what kind of person I am. So I'm telling you, I'm the kind of person who doesn't need to destroy others to feel important. I'm the kind of person who can disagree with someone without calling them evil. I'm the kind of person who understands that real strength comes from building people up, not tearing them down. The words landed like physical blows. Kimmel's face had gone from purple to pale, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. He looked around the studio desperately, as if seeking rescue that wasn't coming. Ford's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it filled the entire space. And you want to know the real difference between us, Jimmy? When I'm done with this conversation, I'll go home and sleep peacefully, knowing I've lived my life with integrity. Can you say the same? The question hung in the air like a sword over Kimmel's head. The host opened his mouth several times, but no words came out. His carefully constructed persona had been completely dismantled by a master craftsman who understood the power of authentic emotion over manufactured outrage. I thought not, Ford said quietly, his point made. He straightened his jacket with deliberate care, every movement conveying dignity and control. You know what, Jimmy? I came here tonight to promote a movie. Instead, I've gotten a glimpse into the soul of modern entertainment, and frankly, I don't like what I see." Ford turned toward the audience, his voice carrying easily to the back rows without amplification. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize that you had to witness this. You came here for entertainment, not a lecture on why discourse in this country has become so toxic. The fault for that lies with people who confuse celebrity with wisdom." The audience was completely silent, mesmerized by the raw authenticity of the moment. This wasn't scripted television. This was real human drama unfolding in real time. Ford turned back to Kimmel one final time. "Jimmy, I hope someday you understand the difference between holding people accountable and destroying them. I hope you learn that real courage isn't punching down at people who can't fight back, it's having the strength to admit when you're wrong." With that, Ford walked toward the exit, his footsteps echoing in the deadly quiet studio. Kimmel finally found his voice, calling out desperately, "Harrison, wait. We can work this out." Ford paused at the edge of the stage, turning back with a look of profound disappointment. "No, Jimmy, we can't, because working it out would require you to listen, and you've forgotten how to do that." The legendary actor disappeared into the wings, leaving behind a stunned studio and a host who looked like he'd been hit by a freight train. Kimmel stood frozen behind his desk, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly, as he processed what had just happened. The audience began to murmur, then talk, then buzz with excitement, as the reality of what they'd witnessed sank in. They had just seen one of Hollywood's most respected figures deliver a masterclass in dignity under fire, while simultaneously watching a talk show host's credibility crumble in real time. Security finally moved to restore order, but the damage was done. Within minutes, cell phone footage would leak, despite confiscation efforts. Within hours, the confrontation would be trending worldwide. Within days, Kimmel's ratings would plummet as viewers turned away from what many saw as mean-spirited activism disguised as entertainment. The incident became a watershed moment, sparking nationwide conversations about the role of entertainers in political discourse and the difference between accountability and destruction. For Harrison Ford, it represented a final definitive statement about the values that had guided his remarkable career. For Jimmy Kimmel, it became a harsh lesson in the difference between wielding power and earning respect. As the studio lights dimmed and the audience filed out in animated discussion, one thing was crystal clear. They had just witnessed television history, and not the kind that would be celebrated in Hollywood circles.